The diamonds came down the great staircase at 9:30, and they were not on the Duchess. They blazed at another woman's throat, the collar the whole county knew as the Caromere diamonds, 3 ropes of old brilliants that, or so the world believed, had lain in their velvet case for 100 years, and come out only to grace a Caromere bride. Tonight they lay against Ottolin Vasey's bare neck, and she wore them the way a thief wears a thing she has already decided to keep. The ballroom understood at once. 40 guests, and not one of them looked at the woman on the stairs. They looked instead at the far end of the room where Aloan, Duchess of Caromere, stood very straight beside her husband and did not move. Aldrich had given the order himself. A footman had carried the case up that afternoon to Mrs. Vesey's room, not the Duchess's, and the whole house had known it by supper. To wear another woman's jewels is mere vanity. To be handed them by her own husband, in her own house, before her own guests, is a thing with no polite name at all. Eloan lifted her glass. Her hand was perfectly steady. She smiled at a baroness 3 feet away, as though her heart were not in that very moment breaking quietly into 2 clean halves. No one in that bright and crowded room saw what she decided. There was one living thing at Harrowdean Court that the Duke of Caromere could not command, and it was not his wife. In the long stone stable block beyond the West Court, in the last and largest box, lived a black stallion named Erebus. He stood 17 hands of polished darkness, with a white star hidden beneath his forelock like a secret, and he had put 2 grooms in the infirmary and sent a 3rd down the road to look for gentler work. The men called him the Devil's Own, and crossed the yard to keep clear of his stall. The head groom, Tomlin, kept a loaded fowling piece on a peg by the tack room door, and had told the Duke to his face that the animal ought to be shot before it killed a man. Aldrich had agreed. He had been agreeing for a month. Yet the order was somehow never quite given, because everyone at Harrowdean knew the single fact that made the shooting of Erebus more delicate than it looked. The horse was gentle as a lamb for the Duchess, and for no other soul alive. She went to him at first light, before the house woke, when the moor was still gray, and the rooks had not yet left the elms. She brought no whip, no twitch, no man to hold his head. She brought an apple in her bare hand and a low voice, and the great savage neck that struck at grooms would fold itself over the half-door and press, heavy and trusting, against her shoulder. He would breathe into her hair. He would stand for her like a carved thing while she ran her palm down the long muscle of his throat, and told him, in the soft Cornish she never used in the drawing-room, that he was a good boy, the best and the bravest boy, and that she had not forgotten where the 2 of them came from. For Erebus was hers. He had been foaled on her father's land above the great Cornish sea, out of her father's finest mare, and he had come east in her bridal train 4 years ago, like a piece of her own heart walking on 4 legs. The marriage had taken everything else that was hers and rubbed her name from it. Not the horse. The horse remembered. In 4 long years, the horse had never once pretended she was less than she truly was. The household read the bond the way frightened people always read what they cannot explain. The kitchen maids whispered that the Duchess carried the old Cornish charm in her blood, that she could talk the temper out of any beast. Tomlin said only that it wasn't natural, and touched the cold iron of his gun. Even Aldrich, who believed in nothing he could not bank or breed, had been unsettled by it. He had come down to the yard one morning, meaning to master the brute himself, and Erebus had screamed and struck the boards to splinters and rolled the whites of his eyes, and then Eloan had stepped past her husband without a word, laid one flat hand upon the velvet nose, and the storm had simply gone out of him like a candle pinched between 2 fingers. The Duke had not liked that. A man does not care to learn in his own stable yard that a creature will die before it obeys him and lie down meek for his wife. So on every ordinary morning, the pattern held. She came, he gentled, and for 1/4 of an hour in the raw dawn, the Duchess of Caromere was neither ornament nor afterthought, nor the woman whose jewels another woman wore. She was simply Eloan, and there was one heartbeat on all that great estate that knew her name, and was glad of it. Then she would kiss the white star, climb back to the cold grand house, and put on her other face at the door. And no one at Harrowdean had yet thought to ask the only question that mattered. If the horse was hers, truly, lawfully, unanswerably hers, then what else in this proud house might be hers as well? Her name had not always been Caromere, and the name she was born to had bought every grey stone of the house that now looked down upon her. She was Eloan Trevanion, the only child of Jago Trevanion of Penhale, and the Trevanions had been rich, vulgarly, gloriously, ungentlemanly rich, at a time when the Dukes of Caromere were quietly selling their grandmother's portraits to pay the men who mended the roof. 1 tin first, then copper. Then a fleet of ships out of Falmouth that her father had built up from 3 leaking luggers and an unholy quantity of nerve. Jago Trevanion had wanted no title and would have laughed at the offer of one. What he wanted, at the very end, with the sea cough carrying him off by inches, was a single thing, that his clever, watchful, soft-spoken daughter should be safe after he was gone. So when the old Duke of Caromere, Aldrich's father, drowning in debt, and far too proud to name it aloud, came courting the Trevanion fortune in the convenient shape of the Trevanion girl, Jago smiled and gave his blessing, and then sat down with the sharpest solicitor in the West Country and drew up a marriage settlement with teeth in it. The world saw a merchant's daughter marrying high above her station, grateful and a little dazzled. The world saw, wrongly, what the paper actually said folded now inside a plain tin box at the bottom of Marin's mending basket, where no Caromere would ever stoop to look, was that the entire Trevanion fortune entered the marriage as Eloan's own separate estate, hers and never her husband's, held in trust, and returnable to her whole and undivided should certain conditions her father had named ever come to pass. The income kept Harrowdean's lamps burning. The capital had paid the dead duke's debts and saved the dukedom from the auctioneer's hammer. And the celebrated Caromere diamonds, the collar, the drops, the great pale stones, the whole county side over, had never been Caromere diamonds at all. They were the Trevanion stones, her grandmother's, and her grandmother's before that, lent into this cold, proud house along with everything else that had made its rescue possible. Aldrich did not know the half of it. His father had hidden the worst of the truth from him out of shame, and the family solicitor, a discreet and costly man named Sennett, had been paid a handsome retainer to go on hiding it. Aldrich believed, as men in his position so loved to believe, that the money was simply his, that the diamonds were simply his, that his wife was a dull and decorative fact of his property like the lake or the long gallery, agreeable enough, and entirely owned. He believed, therefore, that he might lift those diamonds from their 100-year case and clasp them about the throat of his mistress the way a man hands a sweet to a child, and that his wife would weep or rage or do the one thing women in her position were built to do, which was precisely nothing. He did not know that he had just fastened her own grandmother's diamonds around another woman's neck. He did not know that every condition her dying father had written into that settlement, every careful, loving, ruthless line of it, drafted against exactly this kind of man, turned upon a single word, and that the word was dishonor. Eloan had carried this knowledge for 4 years the way she carried everything else, quietly, wholly, and alone. She had told herself it did not signify, that she had made her peace, that a marriage was a marriage, and a vow was a vow, and that a woman did not unstitch a sacrament merely because she was lonely inside it. For 4 years, that telling had held. It held until 9:30 that evening, when the diamonds came down the staircase on another woman, and something in Eloan Trevanion that had been folded very small and put away for a very long time stood up and stretched and remembered its own true name. She smiled at her bareness. She set down her glass. And somewhere beneath the flawless calm of her face, a clause her father had written in his last winter began, ever so softly, to tick. The ball did not end so much as drain away, guest by guest, carriage by carriage, until the great hall held nothing but candle smoke and the sweet wreckage of spent flowers. Eloan had smiled through every minute of it. She had danced with a bishop and a brigadier. She had admired when asked, and she was asked, cruelly, twice, how very well the diamonds became Mrs. Vasey. She had answered that the stones had never looked better, and meant something by it that not a soul in the room had ears to hear. Only when the last wheels had ground away down the long avenue did she go out, still in her pale silk, across the wet west court to the stables. She carried no lamp. She knew the way in the dark as she knew the way through her own grief. Erebus was awake. He always knew her step. The black head came over the half door, and she put both arms about the great warm neck and stood there in the blackness. And for the first time in that whole long night, she let the mast come down. She did not weep loudly. She had unlearned that, years ago, tears were a coin that women like Adeline loved to be paid in. She only pressed her face into the coarse warmth of his mane and breathed once in a way that shook her whole body, while the horse stood like a patient wall of muscle and bore it for her. A single tear went into his coat and was lost there. That was all. That was all she would permit herself to spend. Not for them, she whispered against him. Never again for them. And then, because she was who she was, she straightened. She dried her face with the back of one gloved hand. She mastered it, the way her father had taught her to master the seasickness as a child, by fixing her eyes on the far horizon and simply refusing to be moved. By the time she stepped back from the stall, her face was calm once more, and quiet, and entirely her own. She did not know that a window had stood lit behind her the whole while. High in the east front, Aldrich watched his wife in the moonlit yard, a glass of brandy going warm and forgotten in his hand. He had expected, he scarcely knew what, a scene, a fit of weeping he could file away as hysteria. Some soft collapse that would prove him right to have grown weary of her. What he saw instead was a woman embrace a killer of a horse, as though it were the only friend she owned in the world, break for the space of a single breath, and then gather herself back together with a discipline he was not at all certain he possessed. It was not her grief that unsettled him. It was her command of it. And for the first time in 4 careless years, the Duke of Caromere felt the cold touch of a thought he could not name, that he might have very badly misjudged the quiet woman he had married. He told himself it was the brandy. Aldrich, 9th of his name, lay in the great curtained bed where 6 dukes had died before him, stared up into the dark of the canopy, and told himself a number of comfortable things. That a wife who did not weep was a wife who did not greatly care. That a Lowen had always been cold, a still gray pond of a woman, useful, decorative, dull. That a man of his blood and his burdens was surely entitled to a little warmth wherever he might find it, and that he had found it in Adeline, who laughed, who blazed, who wore diamonds as though she had been born expressly to outshine them. These were old thoughts, and they had always fitted him comfortably before, the way a good coat fits. Tonight they hung wrong at every seam, for he kept seeing it. The yard, the moonlight, the pale silk, the savage horse, standing meek as a lamb beneath his wife's bare hands. He kept seeing the single breath that had shaken her, and the way she had stopped it. Not, he understood now, because she felt too little, but because she felt far too much, and had simply resolved that not one drop of it would be spilled, where her enemies might gather to watch. He had given Adeline the collar as a kind of test, though he had not confessed as much even to himself. He had wanted Lowen to react. He had wanted, if he was honest, here in the dark, where a man cannot help being honest, to be released, to provoke some ugliness in her that would let him feel ill-used and justified, and free to want what he wanted. A scene would have done it. Tears would have done it. A shrieking accusation before the bishop would have done it beautifully. She had given him nothing whatever to despise. She had given him only dignity. And dignity, he was discovering, is a most uncomfortable thing to have wronged. Down the corridor, in the guest suite he had given over to his favorite Adeline, lay asleep with the diamonds spread across the dressing table like the spoils of a small war. She had not wished to surrender them at the evening's end. Surely the Duchess does not begrudge them. she had murmured, turning her white throat to the glass. She has so little use for pretty things. And he had let her keep them till morning because it was easier, because Adeline had a gift for making everything difficult feel briefly deliciously simple. But lying here in the dark, he found her voice had begun, ever so faintly, to grate upon him. There was a greed in it he had mistaken for spirit. There was a cruelty in she has so little use for pretty things that he had laughed at 3 hours ago and could not, for the life of him, laugh at now. He thought of the early days when the marriage was new and Eloin had come to Harrowdean a stranger from the far green edge of the kingdom, with sea light in her, and a quickness she took great pains to hide. He remembered, he had forgotten that he remembered, how she had once set the estate accounts to rights in a single afternoon, accounts that had defeated his steward for a week, and had then said nothing of it, and let the man take the credit, because she had seen that he was frightened of being thought a fool. Aldrich had thought her merely modest. He wondered now, with a slow cold turning low in his stomach, whether he had spent 4 years living beside an intelligence a good deal larger than his own, and had been too well pleased with himself to notice it. Why did she not fight? That was the splinter. He could not work free. Every creature he had ever known fought for what was its own. Tomlin fought for his place. Adeline fought, prettily and without cease, for everything she touched. The very horse in the yard would fight any hand on earth that was not hers. People did not quietly surrender what they prized. They clawed, they wept, they schemed. Eloin had stood in the middle of her own ballroom and watched another woman wear her jewels, and had said only that the stones had never looked better and had meant something by it. He was certain of that now. He had heard it. At the time, as the sound of defeat. He lay awake and heard it again, and this time it did not sound like defeat at all. It sounded like a woman quietly closing a ledger and ruling a line beneath the total. He rose, which he never did at such an hour, and stood at the black window. The sky over Brackmore was the color of pewter, not yet touched with any light. He thought unaccountably of the muniment room at the dark heart of the house, of old Senate's locked Japan boxes, of the deeds and the settlements that no duke ever troubled himself to read, because dukes are not made to read papers, they are made to own them. He had never once looked inside those boxes. His father had warned him off them with the heat he had taken, at the time, for simple bad temper. Leave the papers to Senate, boy. They are dull, and they are done with. For 4 years, that had suited Aldrich entirely. Now, watching the slow gray climb of the coming dawn, he felt the first thin thread of a dread he could not name, the suspicion that a man may hold the title to a house and still not know what is written in its deepest drawer, and that his wife, his still, his quiet, his never-fought-for wife, might know it far better than he ever had. He would speak with her at breakfast, he decided. He would set it right, or some part of it right. There was time enough for that. He was wrong about that. There was almost no time at all. Eloin had not undressed. She sat at the dead hearth of her own room, with the pale silk still upon her and her hair still pinned, and she waited, because waiting was a thing she did better than anyone alive. A little after 4, Marin came. Marin had been her nurse in Cornwall, and her maid in every year since, and she crossed the sleeping house like a small gray moth, and she heard a great deal that grander people imagined was private. She knelt at her mistress's chair and spoke low and quick. Mrs. Vesey was leaving at first light, Marin said. The traveling chaise was already ordered for sunrise, and she meant to carry the diamonds away with her to London. She had told her own woman so, laughing in her glass, as a parting gift from his grace. What was given, she had said, was given. Eloin said nothing. Her hands lay still and folded in her lap. There was more, Marin whispered, and worse of it. Mr. Sennett had been sent for. The solicitor was to come up on the morning coach before noon to set his hand to some small matter of the estate. The steward had let the phrase drop in the servants' hall over his beer. No one below stairs knew what the small matter might be. But Marin, who could not read a single word, had carried that plain tin box for 4 long years, and she knew well enough what manner of small matter brings a duke's solicitor hurrying up a country road before noon. So, there it lay, set out plain in the dark. By sunrise, the stones would be gone from the house. By noon, the papers might be quietly touched. Whatever Elowen meant to do, she would have to do it in the few black hours that yet stood between this moment and the dawn, alone in a hostile house, against a husband, a mistress, and a paid man of the law. For so long, she had told herself there was time. She understood now that there had never once been time. There had only ever been her own unwillingness to sit down and count it. She rose. She crossed to the window and looked out at the dark shoulder of Brackmore, where the first grey was not yet, but soon now, very soon, beginning to gather behind the moor. Then, "It must be tonight," she said softly, to no one at all, "and there is but one soul beneath this roof with the nerve to help me do it." She took up a single candle and went out into the sleeping house to wake the most dangerous old woman in England. The Dowager Duchess of Caramere did not sleep as other people slept. She lay in her great bed in the oldest wing of the house, like a queen lying in state, propped upon 7 pillows, a branch of candles burning beside her because she had decided long ago that the dark was an impertinence she need not tolerate. She was 81 years old. She had buried a husband, a son, and the better part of her own illusions, and she frightened the entire household down to the kitchen cat. When Elowen entered without knocking, the old woman did not start. She turned her head upon the pillows, and her eyes, black, undimmed, dreadful in their cleverness, settled on her grandson's wife with the sharp satisfaction of a hawk that has waited a very long time for one particular mouse to finally show some sense. "So," said Theodosia, "you have come at last. I had begun to fear you never would. You know what he did tonight. The whole county knows what he did tonight. He hung your grandmother's diamonds about a greedy woman's neck and called it generosity. My grandson has a number of gifts. Subtlety is not among them, and neither, it grieves me to say, is sense." She patted the counterpane with one ringed hand. "Sit. You shall not say what you have come to say while hovering about like a footman who has lost the tea-tray." Elowen sat. "I knew your father," Theodosia said, and Elowen went, very still indeed. "Oh yes, Jago. Trevanion, a short, broad, brown man who smelled of tar and would not have been cheated by God himself on a Sunday. He came to this house once before your wedding, and he and I sat up over a bottle of my late husband's best port until 3 in the morning, and we understood one another inside the first 10 minutes, which is rather more than I can say for most of the people I have known 50 years. The candle flame stood straight up in the still air. "He did not trust the Carameres," the old woman went on, "and he was entirely right not to. He loved you to the point of ferocity, and he was dying, and he knew to the inch what manner of men my son and my grandson were, proud, poor, and persuasive. So he built you a house of paper that no Caramere could ever pull down. And because he was wiser than any duke I have met, he did not leave the keeping of it to lawyers, who can be bought, nor to husbands, who can be fools. He left it, my dear, to me." Elowen's breath stopped in her throat. "I am the trustee of your father's settlement, Elowen. I have been these 4 years, while you crept about my house playing the meek little mouse. The true instrument, not Senate's tame copy, the real one, signed and sealed and witnessed 3 times over, has lain in my own strong box since the week before you were wed. I gave your father my word I would never force your hand. That you must choose your own hour, and choose it free. I confess I had begun to think you never would choose it at all, and that I should die with the thing still locked away, and you still scrubbing your pride down to the bone for a man not worth your contempt." For a moment Elowen could not speak. Years of silence sat in her chest like a stone, and the stone was, very slowly, beginning to dissolve. "There is a clause," she managed, "about dishonor. There is." The old woman's smile was a terrible and a beautiful thing. "Your father wrote it himself in his own hand against this very night, though he never lived to see it come. He guessed the shape of the insult almost to the letter, He was, as I say, not a man easily cheated, not even by the future. By the terms of it, the public gift of the Trevanian jewels to another woman before witnesses dissolves the trust entire. The capital, the income, the stones, all of it reverts to you, absolutely and at once, free of the marriage and free of him. 40 people watched my grandson do it tonight. A bishop watched him. He has signed your release with his own vanity, child, and he does not even know that he held the pen. Eloan pressed her hand to her mouth. When she lowered it, her voice was steady. Then I must hold the proof of it before Senate can move. The master instrument is in your strongbox. But there is a schedule, an inventory naming the stones as Trevanian property, in Senate's muniment boxes below. The dowager's face hardened. Yes, he keeps it locked, the sly creature, and he comes up on the morning coach to make it quietly vanish before noon. I have no doubt of it. We hold the master, but the schedule that ties those diamonds to your family by name lies in that cold room downstairs. And if it should chance to burn in Senate's grate this morning, you may spend 10 years and your father's good name in court, proving what was always yours. She fixed Eloan with her black stare. There is a difference, my girl, between revenge and justice, and the difference is the whole of your dignity. Revenge is a thing you do to him. Justice is merely the truth allowed at last to fall where it has always belonged. You need not lift a single hand against my grandson. You need only stop holding him up. Take back what was yours. Walk from this house with your head as your father carried his, and let the wreckage settle upon the guilty by its own honest weight. That is not vengeance, that is gravity. Eloan rose. Her face had changed. Somewhere in the last quarter of an hour, the maid had gone out of it altogether, and the merchant's daughter, quick, cold, and unafraid, had come home. "Lend me your keys," she said. The old woman drew 2 keys from beneath her pillow, where they had apparently waited a very long time for this hand, and laid them in Eloan's palm. "Go quietly," she said, "and Eloan, when it is done, come back and tell me everything. I have not enjoyed a morning this much since my husband died. We will pause the story here for just a moment. If this tale of a quiet woman finding her strength is holding you, please do take a second to subscribe. It truly helps these stories reach the people who need them, and there are many more waiting for you. And now, back into the darkened sleeping house and down to the one cold room where the whole of the morning's battle would be silently won or lost. The muniment room lay at the cold heart of Herodine, a windowless stone chamber behind the steward's office where 400 years of the dukedom's secrets slept in iron-banded chests and stacks of black Japan tin. No fire was ever lit there for fear of the papers. The air tasted of dust and cold wax, and the particular chill of a place the sun has never once been permitted to find. Eloan went down to the sleeping house with the dowager's keys clutched in her fist and a single shielded candle held low against her skirts. She had learned the geography of Herodine the way a prisoner learns the cell, every loose board, every door that sighed upon its hinges, and she went by the back stairs and the servants' passage so as to pass no bedroom door. Twice she froze at a sound and stood breathing in the blackness until it proved to be only the old house settling on its bones. Once a mouse ran across the toe of her slipper and she did not so much as flinch. She had spent 4 years unlearning how to flinch. At the turn of the lower passage she heard voices, and her heart climbed into her throat. 2 of them, low. Behind the steward's door, which stood ajar with a knife of yellow light along its edge, she pressed herself flat into the black recess of a doorway and made herself a part of the stone. One voice was the steward's. The other was thin, dry, and precise, and it took her a moment to place it, for she had heard it only twice in 4 years. Senate. The solicitor had not come on the morning coach at all. He had come in the night quietly, ahead of his own appointment, the better to do his quiet work before the house was up. "Before 9, Senate was saying. "His Grace signs. The deed is witnessed. The schedule goes into my case and out of this house, and the matter is closed past any unpicking. See that the fires are lit early in the small library. I shall want a good blaze." Aloan understood the blaze. Her blood went cold, and then very, very hot. A latch lifted. She shrank into the dark as the steward came out with a candle and went off toward the kitchens, his footsteps fading, and a moment later Senet himself emerged, locked the steward's door behind him, and walked away in the other direction toward the guest wing, his dry tread precise upon the flags. She did not breathe until the silence had swallowed him whole, so she had less time than even Theodosia had feared, and a man already awake in the house who meant to burn her name to ash by 9 o'clock. The muniment door was oak, studded, and locked. The dowager's larger key turned it with a heavy, oiled click that fell upon the stone passage, loud as a pistol shot. The Loan slipped inside and drew the door to behind her, and this time, schooled by the fright, she turned the key again in the inner lock, and was glad of it. She set the candle upon the steward's high desk and shielded its flame behind a fat ledger so that its light fell only where she needed it, and nowhere else. Senet's boxes stood in a row along the far wall, 6 of them black, each lettered in faded gilt. She knew the one she wanted. The dowager had described it to the letter. The 4th from the left, Caromir, settlements and schedules. It was locked, of course. But Jago Trevanian's daughter had not come into the dark unarmed, and the small brass key the old woman had pressed into her hand slid into the box lock, and after one breathless, reluctant moment, turned. Inside lay the paper architecture of a proud and failing house, marriage articles, mortgages, the long, sad arithmetic of a family living for a century beyond its means. Her fingers moved through them quickly and surely. She had read documents like these at her father's knee before she was 12. He had taught her that the truth of any family is written not in its portraits but in its deeds, and that a woman who can read a settlement need never again be at the mercy of a man who cannot. And there it was. A folded parchment, sealed, endorsed in a clerk's neat hand, schedule of jewels, being the separate property of Aloan Trevanian, spinster, brought by her into her marriage. She unfolded it with hands that wished to tremble and would not be allowed to, her grandmother's collar described stone by stone. The drops, the great pale brilliance, each one named, each one weighed, each one bound by law to her family and to her. Beneath it lay something newer, the ink scarcely dry. She drew it out and read, and the heat in her blood became something cold and clear and final. It was a deed of gift, drawn in Senet's own dry hand, dated that very day. By it the Duke of Caromir conveyed the diamond parure, known as the Caromir collar, absolutely and irrevocably to one Adeline Vesey, widow. There was a line at the foot for the Duke's signature. It was not yet signed. It was to be signed, no doubt, before the bishop's eyes were fairly open, witnessed, sealed, and made a fact of law before any soul who might object had so much as risen for breakfast. So that was the small matter. Not to lend the diamonds, to give them, to tear the last and dearest of the Trevanian stones out of her hands forever and fasten them upon her rival, with the law's own blessing and a good fire to burn the proof. Her father had been right about everything except the date. Aloan folded the schedule and the unsigned deed together and slid them into the bodice of her gown, against her heart, where 4 years ago she had carried her father's last letter on the long, cold journey east. Then she began, with great care, to set Senet's box back exactly as she had found it, that he might not learn until far too late that the ground had moved beneath him. A board creaked in the passage. She pinched the candle dead between finger and thumb, and the dark came down, absolute and total, black water closing over her head. She stood with her back against the cold tin boxes and did not breathe. The handle of the muniment door turned and met the lock she had blessed herself for turning. It rattled softly, twice. A silence. Then a line of gray light bloomed at the very edge of the frame as a key, another key, a master key, slid home from the outside, and the lock gave, and the door swung in. Lamplight, low and gold, swung across the stone floor and climbed the chests toward where she stood, and a voice she knew far better than she wished to quiet and entirely awake, spoke into the dark. "I wondered," said Aldrich, "who would come for them first. I confess I did not think it would be you." She did not move. She did not speak. For one wild instant, the old instinct rose in her like a tide. To apologize, to explain, to make herself small and soft and harmless, as she had made herself small and soft and harmless through all the long years of her marriage. She felt the very shape of the lie forming on her tongue. "I could not sleep, your grace. I came only to fetch a book of my father's." She let it die unspoken. She was done, now and forever, with being small. Slowly, she straightened her spine. She heard Aldrich set the lamp upon the steward's high desk. The gold light steadied and spread and filled the stone chamber, and she lifted her chin and looked her husband full in the face. For what she understood, with a strange, far-off sorrow, to be the first time in years that she had truly looked at him at all. He looked terrible, not angry. She had braced herself for anger and could have met anger standing. He looked instead like a man who has walked into a room he has known all his life and found the floor simply gone from under him. He stood in his shirt sleeves, his dark hair disordered, and his gaze traveled from her face down to the place where her hand pressed flat against her bodice, over the hidden papers, and slowly back up to her face again. "What have you taken?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "That is yours." Her voice did not shake. The perfect quiet of it seemed to unsettle him more than any weeping or any rage could have done. He had come down expecting a thief he could master, or a wife he could forgive grandly, and so feel large again. He had found neither. "Show me," he said. She drew the folded parchments from against her heart and laid them open upon the desk in the pool of lamplight, and she watched his face as he read, watched him take in the schedule first, the long, patient inventory of stones described and named and bound by law to a Cornish family he had always thought somewhere beneath him, and then the deed of gift. His own deed, the unsigned instrument that would have given her grandmother's diamonds to Adeline Vasey for all time. "You meant to sign this in the morning," she said. It was not a question, and he did not insult either of them by treating it as one. His jaw worked. He had the look of a man assembling, piece by terrible piece, a picture he very much did not wish to see whole. "You do not understand what you are holding," he said at last, but there was no force left in it. It was the last reflex of a drowning pride, and they both heard it drown. "I understand it," Eloin said quietly, "better than any man beneath this roof, including the one who drew it and the one who meant to sign it. Shall I tell you, Aldrich, what you have never known about your own affairs? Shall I tell you what your father took such pains that you should never learn?" He said nothing. So she told him. She stood in that cold stone room with the dawn not yet lit beyond the walls, and in a clear and unhurried voice, the voice of a woman who had read every clause 100 times over in the long, sleepless nights of 4 long years, she laid his ruin before him as neatly as a surgeon laying out his instruments upon a cloth. That the Trevanian fortune had never been his, nor his father's before him. That it had come into the marriage as her separate estate, held in trust, hers and hers entire. That the income alone had kept Harrowdean's lamps lit and its roof whole, and that the capital had buried the old duke's debts, so deep the county had never guessed how near the family had stood to the auctioneer's hammer. That the diamonds with which he had been so careless, so lordly, so generous upon another woman's throat had never been Carrowmere diamonds at all, but Trevanian stones, her grandmother's, and her grandmother's before that, named to her by law in the very schedule that lay open now beneath his stricken hand. And that her father, that short brown man who smelled of tar and would not be cheated by God himself, had written into the settlement a single quiet, ruthless clause against the precise contingency of a Carrowmere who would one day shame his daughter before the world. That the public gift of the Trevanian jewels to another woman, before witnesses, dissolved the trust entire, and returned to her, absolutely and at once, every penny and every stone, free of the marriage and free of him. 40 people watched you clasp my grandmother's diamonds upon your mistress tonight," she said. A bishop watched you do it. You did not merely break my heart, Aldrich, which, God help me, I might in time have found a way to forgive. You broke the trust. With your own 2 hands before witnesses, you signed away the whole of everything you married me to keep, and you did not even know that you were holding the pen. The lamp hissed. Far off in the sleeping house, a clock told the half hour, and the single note fell into the silence like a stone dropped into a deep well. Aldrich sat down upon the steward's stool, slowly, as though his legs had ceased to take his orders. He looked at the papers. He looked at his wife. And upon his face, where she had so long expected to find at last either anger or contempt, there bloomed instead something far worse for him and far stranger to her, a dawning, devastating recognition. "Who are you?" he said. He did not say it as a master says it to a servant. He said it as a man says it to an equal. He has only just met, across the cooling body of the marriage, he has only just killed. "I am Elowen Trevanion," she said. "I always was. You were merely too well pleased with yourself ever." To look for a long moment, he could not answer her. When at last he did, his voice had shed every ounce of its ducal weight, and was only the voice of a frightened man in a bare stone room before the dawn. "Stay." The word came out cracked. "Elowen. It need not be known. None of it. Senate can be silenced. He is a paid man. He will take a price. The diamonds will be back in your hands within the hour. I swear it on my name. Adeline will be gone from this house before the gong, and never spoken of again. We can mend this. I will mend it. Only stay." And Elowen looked at the man she had married, who in 4 long years had never once asked her to stay until the very moment he understood precisely what it would cost him to let her go, and she felt the last small foolish thread of her old hope draw tight and snap and fall away and leave her lighter than she had felt in the whole of her life. "No," she said gently, almost to her own astonishment, kindly. "I do not think that I will." And somewhere beyond the thick stone walls of Harrowdean, faint and gray and entirely certain, the first cock of the Brackmore dawn began to crow. By the time Elowen climbed back up into the living part of the house, the black windows had begun to bleed to the color of slate, and the first servants were stirring in the deep of the building, a clatter of a grate being raked, the cough of a sleepy footman. She had perhaps 2 hours of half-dark left to her, and a great deal to do in them. She did not run. She had not run from anything in a very long time, and did not propose to begin now. She walked to the dowager's wing, and laid the schedule and the unsigned deed in Theodosia's waiting hands, and the old woman read them by candlelight with a face that grew, line by line, into something close to terrible joy. "He drew a deed of gift," Theodosia breathed. "The arrogant young fool meant to give them away outright. Oh, your father is laughing somewhere, Elowen. I can very nearly hear him." She set the papers down and rang, hard, for her own woman. "Now, we do this properly, before witnesses, in the light, where nothing can later be whispered into a different shape. Dress me. And send word to my grandson that the Dowager Duchess of Caromere desires the family in the small library at first light, all of the family, mind, and that includes the guest. The guest did not wish to come. Adeline Vasey was discovered in her room, half into her traveling clothes. The diamonds already nested in a velvet case among her packed boxes. The chaise she had ordered standing ready in the grey yard below. When the dowager's summons reached her, she laughed it off. When it was repeated, with the weight of the old woman's name behind it and a pair of unsmiling footmen at the door, the laugh thinned considerably. She came down at last with her chin high and the velvet case clutched in both gloved hands, having decided, one could see, to brazen the whole thing out. She had badly mistaken the room she was walking into. She came down the great stair the way she had come down it the night before, slowly, deliberately, conscious of her own beauty, conscious of the eyes she imagined upon her. But there were no admiring eyes this morning. The hall was empty and gray and smelt of cold ash, and the 2 footmen walked a pace behind her like jailers, and somewhere above her she heard very faintly the sound of the chaise being turned in the yard ready to carry her away, though whether toward triumph or toward nothing at all, she had not yet understood. She lifted her chin a degree higher and told herself it was triumph. The diamonds were in the case in her hands. Possession, she had always found, was a great deal of the law. The small library was full of cold dawn, light, and colder faces. The dowager sat enthroned by the unlit hearth like a judge upon a bench. Aldrich stood at the window with his back half turned, gray-faced, a man watching a building burn that he himself had set the torch to and could now only watch. And the Duchess, the quiet, the decorative, the despised little Duchess, whom Ottoline had dismissed in a single careless sentence the night before, stood very straight and very calm in the center of the room in last night's pale silk, with a folio of papers in one hand, and did not look in the smallest degree like a woman who had lost anything at all. It was the Duchess who unsettled her most. Ottoline had prepared herself for the old woman's venom and the Duke's weakness. She had not prepared herself for this. She had spent a whole season believing Aloin of Caromere to be a dull gray nothing, a piece of the furniture that happened to wear a wedding ring. The woman standing before her now was not dull, and was not gray, and was very far from nothing. And Ottoline felt, for the first time, a cold finger of doubt trailed down her spine.
"You wish to see me?"
Ottoline said to the room in general. "At this barbarous hour." "I wish to see the diamonds," said the dowager pleasantly. "Open the case." His Grace gave them to me. Ottoline's grip tightened upon the velvet, freely, as a gift. "I will not be. He gave you nothing," Eloin said. It was the first time she had ever addressed the woman directly, and the quiet of her voice cut through Ottoline's bluster like a cold knife through warm butter. No one crossed the room, unhurried, sovereign, and from the folio in her hand, she drew the deed of gift and held it up open, so that the other woman might see the foot of it plainly. "This is the deed that would have made them yours," she said. "Drawn yesterday, witnessed by no one, signed, you will observe, by no one at all. A gift in law is not a gift until the deed is executed, Mrs. No. Vesey, and this deed was never executed, and now it never shall be. Which means the stones about which you have been so confident remained every hour of last night, exactly what they have been these 100 years and more, the property of my family and of me. She let that settle. You did not wear my diamonds last night by any right. You wore them on loan from a man who did not own them, to spite a woman he imagined had no use for pretty things." Ottoline's painted composure cracked clean across. She turned to Aldrich, to the man who had set her up the stairs in another woman's jewels, and called it love, and found him still at the window with his back to her, and understood, in that one dreadful turning, the full and final measure of what she was to him, now that he was poor. "Aldrich," she said, "Aldrich, tell them. Give the Duchess her diamonds," Aldrich said. He did not turn around. His voice was ash. "And get out of my mother's library, and out of this house, and do not let me see your face upon the road." For a moment Ottoline stood trembling, the case held against her like a shield. Then the footman stepped forward, and the fight went out of her all at once, and she set the velvet case down upon the table with a small, contemptuous click, as though it were she who discarded it, and not the world that was discarding her. She swept to the door. At the threshold she paused, and looked back at Eloin with the pure venom of the comprehensively defeated. "You think yourself very clever," she said. "No," Eloin answered, without heat, only very patient. "They are not at all the same thing, though. I will allow, they can look alike from a distance." She did not raise her voice. "Your chaise is waiting, Mrs. Vesey. The morning is cold. I should not keep the horses standing." And Ottoline Vesey went, out of the library, out of the great grey house, out of the story altogether, and the wheels of her chaise ground away down the long avenue into the half-dark, carrying with them precisely nothing that had ever truly belonged to her. For a moment no one in the room spoke. The fire had not been lit, and the cold came up off the stone floor, and through the tall windows the sky went on graying toward the dawn. Aldrich had not moved from the window. He had not looked at the woman he was sending away. He had looked the whole while at the woman he had already lost with an expression Aloan could not quite read, and did not any longer very much wish to. It struck her, in the quiet after Adeline's going, how little she felt. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times in her sleepless nights, had imagined it would taste of vinegar and fire, of vindication, of something fierce and hot. It tasted of none of those things. It tasted only of a great cold cleanness, like the air after a storm has finally blown itself out to sea. The woman who had worn her grandmother's diamonds to wound her was gone, and Aloan found she could not even hate her properly. Adeline had been a weapon, nothing more. The hand that had lifted the weapon still stood at the window with its back to the room. Aloan opened the velvet case. Her grandmother's diamonds lay there against the worn silk, cold and pale and patient as the sea. She did not put them on. She closed the case again, quietly, and held it in both hands, and for one moment her terrible calm wavered. Not for the Duke, and not for the jewels, but for the long-dead grandmother she had never known, and the father, who had loved her enough to build her a fortress out of nothing but foresight and law. 2 hours yet to sunrise, murmured the dowager, watching her with bright black eyes. And one more guest still abed in the guest wing, who stole up to this house in the night, ahead of his own appointment, to be early at his mischief, and does not yet know that he is already too late. Sit down, child, and drink something hot. The worst of it is over. She smiled, her terrible smile. Now comes the part I've been looking forward to for 4 years, pot a sink. The solicitor was sent for at 7:30, and came down from the guest wing where he had passed the remainder of the night, for he had not waited upon the morning coach at all, but had stolen up to Harrowdean in the small hours, ahead of his own appointment, the better to be at his quiet work before the house was awake. He came into the small library brisk and dry and certain, a black leather case beneath his arm and a sheaf of instructions in his head, a man who had managed the secret affairs of 2 Dukes of Caromere and fully expected to manage a third before his breakfast. He had been told only that the family wished to see him. He did not yet know that the ground had moved beneath him in the night. He knew it within the minute. He stopped 3 steps into the room. He took in the dowager enthroned by the hearth, and the Duke gray and silent at the window, and the Duchess seated very upright with a velvet case upon her knee, and a second document, a great parchment, heavy with seals and ribbon. A document he had last seen 4 years ago, and had been paid a great deal of money to forget lying, open upon the table in the center of them all. Sennett was a clever man. Cleverness in his profession consists chiefly in knowing the precise instant at which a game is lost. He had the sensation, standing in that cold, bright room, of a man who has walked confidently onto ice. He has crossed 100 times before, and felt it, this once, begin to give beneath his weight. Your Grace, he said carefully to the dowager, I was given to understand His Grace required my attendance upon a matter of the estate. He did, said Theodosia, but the matter has rather grown in the night, Mr. Plough. Sennett, and I find that it is now my matter, and the Duchess's, and not my grandson's at all. Sit, we have been expecting you. We even had the fire laid for you in the small library, exactly as you instructed the steward last evening, though I think you will find that we shall not after all be needing the blaze. Sennett did not sit. His eyes had fixed themselves upon the great sealed parchment, and the color was leaving his face by careful degrees. There came, just then, a knock, and the door opened, and a 4th figure was shown into the room, a stout, kindly, bewildered-looking gentleman in clerical black, blinking at the early hour in the cold faces. It was the bishop who had lodged at Harrowdean overnight after the ball, and had been roused from a comfortable bed by a message from the dowager that he had not felt able to refuse. He had been the most senior guest in the ballroom the night before. He had, as it happened, been standing not 8 feet from the Duke at the moment the diamonds were clasped about Mrs. Vesey's throat. Theodosia, the bishop said a little plaintively, your note was most pressing. I confess I cannot think what business of mine could not have waited upon breakfast. It is a very small thing, my lord, and you may go to your breakfast directly it is done, the dowager said sweetly. I require only that you tell this gentleman, she indicated Senate, what you saw with your own eyes last evening, at about 9:30, upon the great stair. You need not embroider it. The plain fact will serve us beautifully. The bishop, baffled but obliging, told it. He had seen the Duke of Caromere take the famous diamond collar from its case and fasten it with his own hands about the neck of Mrs. Zappa. Before the assembled company, he had remarked upon it to the lady beside him at the time, for it had seemed to him, he coughed, a singular thing to do. Did that answer? It did, the dowager assured him. It answered very well indeed. The bishop, still mystified, was thanked, and bowed out toward his breakfast, having no notion whatever that he had just sealed, with a few sleepy sentences, the dissolution of a fortune and the ruin of a great house. When the door had closed behind him, the dowager turned her black gaze back upon the solicitor. There is your witness, Mr. Senate, she said. A bishop of the Church of England, who will swear, if ever it should come to swearing, to the precise act named in the clause you have spent 4 years pretending does not exist. A whole ballroom saw it besides, but I find one bishop generally does the work of 40 lesser souls. The act is proved. There is no court in the kingdom that would hear you now. She gestured to the parchment. The Duchess will read you the relevant passage, and you will listen, and you will understand at last exactly what you have been so very well paid to help destroy. You recognize the instrument, Eloan said. It was not a question. She rose and took it up and read aloud. Not all of it, for it ran to many close pages, but the parts that mattered, in the clear, unhurried voice she had used in the cold muniment room some hours before. She read the establishment of the trust, the whole Trevanian fortune, settled to her separate use, hers and not her husband's, beyond his reach and beyond his debts. She read the schedule of the jewels, naming the stones one by one as her family's property. And then she read the clause her father had written in his own dying hand. The clause Senate had spent 4 years pretending did not exist in a copy he had carefully made incomplete, that should the Duke of Caromere at any time alienate, gift, or bestow the Trevanian jewels upon any person other than his lawful wife, publicly and before witnesses, the trust should thereupon dissolve, wholly and at once, and the entire capital, income, and chattels, every coin and every stone, should revert absolutely to Eloan Trevania, free and clear of the marriage, and of all claims of her husband, his heirs, and his creditors, from the hour of the act. From the hour of the act, Eloan repeated, and lowered the parchment, and looked at the solicitor. The act took place at 9:30 last night, Mr. Senate, in a ballroom containing 40 witnesses and a bishop of the Church of England. By the time you laid your head upon your pillow in the guest wing, it was already done. The trust was already dissolved. The fortune was already mine. And the deed of gift you drew so neatly for His Grace to sign this morning was waste paper before the ink was dry. For a man cannot give away in the morning what the law has already taken from him in the night. The silence in the room was absolute. You knew of this clause, she went on, and now at last there was an edge beneath the calm, cold, and bright as the edge of the sea in winter. You have always known. You made His late Grace a copy with the teeth filed out of it, and you took his money to keep the original quiet, and when His Grace died, you went on taking my husband's money to keep it quiet still. And last night, when you saw your chance to make the theft permanent and unpickable, you drew a deed of gift and ordered the fire lit early, so that the schedule naming these stones as mine might burn before the house was awake. She set the parchment down. I have the schedule, Mr. Senate. I took it out of your box at 4 o'clock this morning. There will be no fire. Senate's dry composure broke, as Audeline's painted composure had broken, and beneath it was the same small frightened thing that lives beneath all such men. Your Grace, he said, and then did not seem to know which grace he meant, and the word fell apart in his mouth. Madam, I acted upon instruction. The late Duke. It was his wish. You were only paid, said the Dowager with vast contempt. Yes, we have grasped that, Mr. Senate. You may stop saying it. She turned her black gaze upon him like a lamp. Here is what will happen, and you will be silent and grateful, because it is a very great deal better than you deserve. You will surrender every paper in your possession touching this family to the Duchess's own solicitors, whom I shall name within the week. You will make over, in writing, a full and true account of every concealment you have practiced these 4 years. And then you will retire from your profession, quietly and at once, on grounds of failing health, for I assure you, Senate, that your health will fail very suddenly indeed, should you ever attempt to practice it again. Do this, and we shall not see you struck off and prosecuted, as by rights you ought to be. Refuse it, she smiled, and you will discover that an old woman with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous creature God ever made. You may go and consider which you prefer. You have until the Duchess's carriage is ready, which is not long. Senate went. He went stooped and gray and a great deal older than he had come in, and the door closed behind him, and that was the last that Haroldine ever saw of the man who had filed the teeth from a dead man's love. And then there were 3 of them left in the bright still room, the old woman by the hearth, the broken man at the window, and the woman in pale silk who held the velvet case and the heavy parchment, and now the whole future in her 2 quiet hands. Aldrich turned from the window at last. For a long moment, he only looked at her, and she let him look. The gray light had found every line of his face, and he seemed to have aged a decade in a single night. The proud, carved certainty she had married had been planed away, and what was left was merely a man, and not a young one, standing in the wreck of his own making. I keep trying, he said slowly, to find the place where it began, the hour I might have turned aside. I thought it was Adeline. It was not Adeline. She was only the last of it, the loudest. It began long before her. It began the first morning I looked at you across this house and decided that because you were quiet, you were simple. That because you did not demand, you did not feel. That because you asked nothing of me, you were owed nothing. His voice cracked and he let it. You set my accounts to rights and let my steward take the praise. You kept this roof over my head with your father's money and never once threw it in my face. You watched me give your own grandmother's diamonds to another woman, in your own house, and you smiled at a baroness so that no guest of mine should be made uncomfortable by my cruelty, and I called all of that dullness. He shook his head very slowly. I have been the stupidest rich man in England, and I did not even have the excuse of being rich. I was living on your foresight and calling it my birthright. Eloin said nothing. There was nothing she needed to add. He was, for the first time in 4 years, telling the exact truth, and a thing like that is best left to stand on its own. What will you take? He asked. His voice was very low. He did not look at the diamonds. He looked at her. You have the right of everything. The capital, the income, the stones. By that clause you may strip Caromere to the bare stones of its walls and leave me, the title and the debts and nothing else on earth. I will not contest it. I have not the standing, and, God knows, I have not the right. He drew a breath that shook. So take your reckoning alone. I have earned the whole of it, to the last farthing. What will you take? It would have been so easy. The old woman by the fire said nothing, but her black eyes said everything. Child, take everything. He laid the knife in your hand himself, and some small hard part of Eloin, the part that had knelt on cold floors and smiled at her own humiliation across a ballroom and wept exactly 1 tear into a horse's mane because she would permit herself no more. That part of her wanted, very much, to take it all and watch him stand in the ruin of it and call it justice. She thought then of her father. She thought of Jago Trevanion in his last winter propped in his bed above the gray sea, the cough taking him by inches, dictating the clauses of her fortress to the sharpest solicitor in Cornwall, in a voice that grew weaker every day, and never once grew less precise. She had sat in the corner of that room, a girl of 19, and had not understood the half of what he did, only that he did it for love of her. And once when the lawyer had stepped out, her father had turned his head on the pillow and looked at her, with his shrewd brown eyes, and said a thing she had carried east in her heart, and never, in 4 years, allowed herself to take out and look at for fear of what it would cost her. "I am not building you a weapon, my girl," he had said. "Any fool can build a weapon. I am building you a door, so that whatever they do to you in that cold, proud house, and they will do something, for it is in their nature, you will always, always be able to walk out of it with your head up, and owe no man your forgiveness and no man your revenge. Revenge keeps you in the house alone. The door lets you leave. Promise me you will use the door." She had promised. She had been 19, and she had promised, and she had nearly forgotten, until tonight, in the cold and the candlelight when she had remembered her own name. "I will take what is mine," she said, "the Trevanion capital, the income from the day of the act, my grandmother's diamonds, my horse, my maid, and the half of the estates, furnishings that came with my money, an inventory of which my father, being my father, took care to have made on the day I married you." She set the velvet case down upon the table quietly. "And I will leave you the house, Aldrich, the entailed land, the title, the roof your fathers raised. I will not strip Carrowmere to its walls. Not because you do not deserve it, you do, but because I find I would rather walk out of this house as my father's daughter than stay in it 1 hour longer as your judge. The wreckage is yours. I did not make it. I shall simply stop holding it up, and we will both of us discover in the fullness of time exactly how much of this great proud house was only ever standing because a Cornish merchant's girl had her shoulder beneath it." Aldrich closed his eyes. "That is worse than ruin," he said very quietly. "Yes," said Eloan. "I rather think it is. But it is just, and it is not cruel, and those are the only terms on which I am willing to leave." She turned to the dowager. "Thank you for 4 years of patience, and for keeping my father's faith when no one made you. I shall never forget it." "You will not have to," said Theodosia. The old woman rose from her chair with the slow magnificence of a ship coming about, and crossed the room, and took Eloan's face in her 2 dry hands, and looked at her with eyes suddenly bright and wet and fierce. "Because I am coming with you, my girl. Did you imagine I would stay here, in this draughty mausoleum, and play whist with my grandson's regrets? I have a jointure house in the south that has stood empty these 20 years, and a great deal of life left in me that I had thought entirely spent. You will need someone to terrify your new solicitors. I am volunteering." She kissed Eloan's forehead, once like a benediction. "Your father would be insufferably proud of you, as, God help me, am I." Outside, beyond the tall windows, the sky over Brackmore had paled from slate to pearl, and a thin gold line had begun to burn along the eastern edge of the moor. In the gray yard below, a groom, pale and keeping a careful distance, was leading out a great black horse who, for the first time in living memory, stood quiet and gentle on the cobbles, ears pricked toward the house, waiting. The sun was very nearly up. She did not leave in the chaise that had been made ready. She had thought she might, and then, standing in the dim hall with her cloak about her and the velvet case in her hands, she had changed her mind entirely. She went out to the yard instead, into the first true light of the morning, and the great black horse turned his head and saw her and made the low rumbling sound deep in his chest that he made for no one else alive. Eloan handed the diamonds up to Marin in the carriage, and drew on her gloves, and let the frightened groom leg her up into the saddle of the only creature at Harrowdean who had known her name from the very first day and been glad of it. Erebus stood like a lamb beneath her. He had always known. He had known before the Duke, before the Dowager, before Elowen herself had dared to remember, that the woman in the gray gown was not a gray woman at all, but something the cold house had never been able to see, and had, therefore, been determined to break. She gathered the reins. Behind her the carriage waited, with Marin and the Dowager, and a single trunk and a tin box that need never be hidden in a mending basket again. Before her the avenue ran east, down, off the moor, and away. Golden now from end to end with the risen sun, Aldrich came out onto the steps. He did not call to her. Whatever he had been, he had learned at least that much in a single night, that there are doors a man may close behind himself, so finally that no word will ever open them again. He simply stood there, a tall gray figure on the steps of the house that was now only a house, and watched his wife sit a horse no one else could ride. In the light of the morning she was leaving by. Elowen looked back at him once. She felt, to her own faint surprise, no hatred, only a great clean weariness, and beneath it, rising, something that had been folded away so long she had almost forgotten its name. It was not triumph. Triumph is loud, and this was very quiet. It was simply the feeling of a person who has been carrying something impossibly heavy for a very long time, and has at last, in the cold light of dawn, been permitted to set it down. She did not say goodbye. She turned the great horse's head toward the east and the gold, and touched her heel to his side, and Erebus carried her down the long avenue and off the moor and out of the gates of Harrowdean Court as the sun came fully up, and by the time its light had reached the high windows of the house, the Duchess of Carrowmere was gone, and did not ever port. In all the years that followed, come back. They said afterward in the county that the Duke had let his mistress wear the Duchess's jewels, and that by sunrise the Duchess had left forever. They told it as a scandal, and shook their heads, and thought they understood it. They did not understand the half of it. They never knew that she had taken far more than her jewels out of those gates in the dawn, that she had taken the very ground the great house stood upon, and that the proud, cold dukedom they still bowed to was from that morning on a beautiful and hollow shell, kept upright by nothing but appearances, the slow, kind mercy of the woman it had driven away. 2 years later, on the green cliffs above the gray Cornish sea, there stood a house called Penhale that had once belonged to a short brown man who smelled of tar, and that now belonged to his daughter. It was not a grand house, by the measure of Harrowdean, but its windows were always lit, and its doors stood open to the wind off the water, and the people who worked its lands and sailed its ships, for the Trevanian fleet sailed again out of Falmouth under a flag its mistress had designed herself, spoke of the lady who owned it, with a warmth that no rule and no fear had ever bought. She knew their names. She knew the names of their children. She balanced her own accounts in a single afternoon, and let no man take the credit for her cleverness ever again. The Dowager Theodosia lived 3 months of every year at Penhale and terrified everyone delightfully, and died, at last, at the age of 84, in a sunny room facing the sea, with Elowen's hand in hers and a glass of good port within reach, which is as good a way to go as the world allows. Marin kept the keys, and the tin box sat openly upon the library shelf, where anyone might see it, and was never needed again. And in the long paddock above the cliffs where the gorse blazed gold in the spring, a great black horse named Erebus grew old and easy and content, and let the children of the estate ride upon his broad back, and gentled for every soul who came to him, for he had carried his lady home, ever after, to be kind. As for the diamonds, her grandmother's collar, the cause and the emblem of the whole long, quiet war, Elowen wore them exactly once on the 2nd anniversary of the morning she had ridden out of Harrowdean. She wore them to a harvest supper for her own people, among the tar and the salt and the laughter, where they caught the light of 100 ordinary candles and threw it back, and where not one person in the room knew or cared what they had cost, or what they had bought. And she thought, fastening the cold, familiar weight of them about her own throat at last, that her grandmother would have liked that very much, and that her father, somewhere out past the gray edge of the sea he had loved, was laughing still. She had been a duchess, and the world had nearly broken her into nothing. She had walked out of it by sunrise with her head high and her name her own, and built a life so full and so warm and so entirely hers, that the cold house on the moor seemed, in the end, like a dream she had once had on a bad night, long ago, and had been wise enough to wake from.